This morning we're going to be in Exodus chapter 3, and we're going to take care of the first 14 verses in that chapter. If you want to turn there, you can. We are picking up in a series we started last semester. It's a discipleship series called Foundations, where we are talking about how to either build our lives or rebuild our lives with Jesus at the center of it all. And so specifically, we're talking about 30 beliefs, practices, and virtues that are going to help us know God well, do what he calls us to do, and be who he's called us to be. These are the three priorities that we talked about of a disciple all the way back in August. This is what he calls us to, that we would be people that know him well, that we would do what he calls us to do, and that we would be like him in absolutely everything. And so this morning, we are picking up in the belief section of this series. Last semester, we were all about the practices, and this time we're going to be talking about 10 different beliefs that we need to prioritize here that are going to help us know him really, really well. And I want to hammer in this language with you all right here, that when we talk about beliefs or practices or even any of these virtues or anything, we're talking about things that are going to help us know him well. Not that a belief is the thing that makes you know him well. We're recognizing there's a very big difference between knowing the right things about him and actually knowing him really well. Any average fan might say they know a lot of things about Dak Prescott. They can't actually say that they know him really, really well, right? There's a very big difference between those two things. A stalker might know a lot about people, right? Nevertheless, like, we're not called to stalk him. We're not stalkers. That's kind of creepy and all these things. And so it's not what we are about. And so I hope you're with me on that knowing him well is so much more than knowing about him. Right? Knowing him well is so much more than just saying, hey, I believe the right things about him. I can check that box off, and I know the right things about him. Nevertheless, it is not less than knowing the right things about him. And so this morning, I want to jump into some of these beliefs. And the first one I want to talk about is a really big one. It's a grandiose one because very simply, we're going to be talking about God. Right? That's our subject for today, as a God, right? Like his character, his attributes, his qualities, what he's like, some of his character. Who is this God that I've given my life to, that I'm trying to build or rebuild my life around? This past week, I was talking with a buddy of mine, and he was like, hey, so what are you preaching on this week? And I'm like, it's God, right? And he's like, you're preaching about God. Like, what do you preach about the rest of the weeks? Like, what are you doing in that pulpit, right? Like, what else are you talking about? And so, but he asked a question. He goes, so how do you talk about God in 1 week? And I was like, I thought about that a while. I'm like, bro, that's what I've been wrestling with forever. I've been thinking about this one for a little while, and it's a really, really good question. I was like, I don't know where to begin except with this acknowledgement that no matter what we say, no matter what qualities we want to bring up this particular week, it's going to be insufficient in describing who he actually is. And I think that's a good place for us to begin, is this acknowledgement that, hey, everything we talk about today is going to be the tip of the iceberg. It's going to be just an introduction. It's going to be a beginning to this massive, grandiose conversation and in-depth thinking about who God actually is. That this is an acknowledgement that, hey, we are just beginning to scratch the surface of who he actually is, and that everything we say today and the little bit that we focus on today is going to be very, very insufficient in describing the fullness of his character. Nevertheless, I do think we need to jump in and we need to begin somewhere. And so it's exactly what I want to do here today. Before we jump into it, I want to ask you this question. And the question I want you to really think about this, not just pastor question and you're kind of thinking about Lubies, but like the question I want you to think about is this: what are the dominant qualities that come to mind when you think about God? And I want you to really think about, like, conceptualize something. What are those words? What are those qualities that dominate your mind, that come and flood your heart and your mind when you think about who God is? And I know we're not like much of a talk-back church or anything like that. If y'all want to do that in the future, I'm all for it. But right now, if you're up for it, I'd love to hear some things that come to your mind, and you can just shout it out. Some things that come to mind, dominant qualities that come to your mind about who God actually is. Compassionate, present, and love, yes. What'd you say? Father, yeah. He's our Father. Comfort. Omniscient. Forgiving. Protector. Merciful. Man. What'd you say? Sovereign, yeah. Over and above all things. Creator God. It's our Creator God. I love it. Like, I heard the omniscient. We can get into all the omnis, right? Trying to describe the character of God. If we wanted to get into all those things, he's omniscient, he's omnipotent, all-powerful, he's omnipresent, he's everywhere. That'll blow your mind thinking about the character of God, that he's omnipresent. He's triune. And little qualification, we're going to get into the Trinity next week, not so much this week. I feel like a failure for not amplifying that from the very beginning, but we're going to get into that next week more so than this one here. But he's triune. Like, that'll blow your mind thinking about one God, in essence, three distinct persons, and how that all operates in the mystery of what we call the Trinity. We talked about the Father. Is he a father to you? Like, when you think about God, and that word floods your mind, is he a father to you? Do you think about him in that way? Is that a good thing to you? Like, when you think about God, what's the expression on his face? Like, does he have a smile on his face? Is he content? Is he pleasing? Or is he like that teacher that you had when you were a kid that was just constantly dissatisfied with everything about you? Like, they were angry from the time you stepped foot in the classroom? Like, what's his disposition towards you? Like, we could say all kinds of things. He's transcendent, right? He's loving, he's holy, he's just, he's good, he's our protector, he's our provider, he's powerful, he's eternal, he's mysterious, and yet he's noble at the exact same time. He's our good shepherd. Like, what's his posture? What does he look like when you think about him and when he floods your thoughts and your minds when you woke up this morning coming to church saying, I'm ready to worship this idea and this person of God? I love the way A.W. Tozer talks about this, but he says this. He says, we tend, by a secret law of the soul, to move toward our mental image of God. And so what comes to mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. The most determining fact about you is not what you might say or do at any given moment, but what in the depths of your heart you perceive God to be like. And so this is not what we typically think of, and we think is the most defining thing about this. Like, I don't know if you believe that today, but this is exactly what we're going to see in our text here today, that what you think about God, how you see God, how you view God is the most important thing about you, more so than anything you say or do, because the things that you believe about him and think about him and see him as, these are the things that are going to shape the things that you say and you do. And so this is what we're going to see here in our text here this morning. It's Moses essentially moving from this position of being completely stuck where he is to being unstuck. And it all comes after this encounter with the living God where his mind is absolutely blown at the character and nature of our God. And so that's what I want to jump into here today. Exodus chapter 3 is where we're going to be, the first 14 verses. And if you're not familiar with kind of where we are in the story, we're turning the page from Genesis, the very beginnings of the nation of Israel, the people of God. There's a 7-year famine that's going on right now at this point in time. This is Joseph. He was raised up in Potiphar's home, and he led a food program. There's a famine going on, and so all the Israelites, they're not massive in number at this point in time, but they've moved out to Egypt. And so things are going well. Egypt is a place where they have food at that time, so everybody's moved out there, and things are going well for a little while, as long as that first Pharaoh's in control. Years go on, generations pass. Israel's still living out there, and the numbers start getting massive. New Pharaoh comes to town. New Pharaoh starts getting really insecure. Hey, there's a lot of new Israelites on the scene. They're beginning to outnumber us. They're procreating faster than we ever were. And so he starts getting really insecure and decides that he's going to start oppressing the Israelites. The oppression turns into enslavement. That enslavement turns into this decree where he's going to kill the firstborn son of Israel, of every Israelite family. And this is when Moses' story begins to come into view. Chapter 2, Moses' mom isn't down with that. Obviously, she wants her kid to live. And so she decides that when Moses is born, she's going to put him in a basket, puts him in the river. In order to save his life, Pharaoh's daughter comes walking along and sees this little Israelite baby, and her heart goes out to him. She grabs the baby, and knowing that he's an Israelite child, decides to take him into her home and raise Moses as her own. And so this is where things begin to pick up in Moses' story. Goes well for a little while for Moses. He's raised in Pharaoh's home, eating Pharaoh's food, the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Meanwhile, his people, the Israelites, are being oppressed all around him. And so as he grows up and he begins to understand the injustice of the world that he's living in and all the oppression of his people there, he starts getting irate and realizing, hey, this isn't right. This is normal. It's not right. And he starts getting disgusted at what he's seeing. And then one day he's out there and he sees the oppression taking place. He sees an Egyptian beating down one of his Israelite brothers, and he just flips and he takes off and he kills the man who's been beating his Israelite brother. He tries to flee the scene. He starts freaking out. Rumors begin to spread. Pharaoh hears about it, wants Moses dead. And so Moses goes and he just pulls a Forrest Gump on everybody, and he just like keeps running and running and running and running and running. And this is where we pick it up in chapter 3. Like Moses is running. It's about 40 years later. He's about in his mid-60s at this point in time. And he's just been running for his life away from Pharaoh, probably not actively for a long amount of time. But he's at this point in his life where he's feeling defeated. He's feeling like his best days are behind him. He's insecure about who he really is. He doesn't really know. Am I an Israelite? Am I an Egyptian? Like, who am I? My own people are against me because I'm kind of a sellout in Pharaoh's home and things like that. Verse 1, we find him tending to the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, is what it says in verse 1, which means that things haven't gone as planned, right? No one in their mid-60s is planning to live or to still be living with their in-laws at that point in time, right? It's just not kind of how you map out your life or anything at that, like that. And so this is where we find Moses as we pick it up here in chapter 3. It says, and one day when he was tending to the flock of Jethro, he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. And Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. And so Moses thought to himself, I will go over and I will see this strange sight, why the bush did not burn up. When the Lord saw that he'd gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Don't come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, and for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. I feel like we could pause right there and preach a whole sermon right there. And what he says, I've seen your cries, I've seen your suffering, I've heard everything that's going on, and I'm concerned about their suffering. But he says, I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way that the Egyptians are oppressing them. And so now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go back to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they asked me, okay, well, what's his name? What should I tell him? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you're supposed to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. And immediately it says that Moses corrected the Lord's grammar. Like, can you imagine, this is his self-revelation at this point in time. All he says is, I am who I am. Say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. The word that he uses there is pronounced hayah, in the Hebrew, no vowels. That part's debatable in a lot of different ways. But it's pronounced hayah, very ninja-like, right? Like you're cutting a board or something like that. It's just hayah is the way that it's pronounced right there. It's the personal name of God. The name that we know of as Yahweh. We've added in the vowels right there to pronounce it a little bit easier there. It's the personal name of God at that point in time. It's a name that originally wasn't even pronounced out loud. It wasn't said out loud because it was seen to be so holy you shouldn't even say this name out loud. And so the people would replace this word with Adonai. It's why in your English Bibles you probably have Lord, all caps. It's a word that literally means my Lord, my Lord. And so it's the name that is designated. Hey, this is the personal name of God. And this is how he comes and he introduces himself to Moses. Literally, it's the Hebrew word or the Hebrew verb for to be. The Hebrew verb for to be. So Moses is going, okay, God, can I get a name for you? What am I supposed to tell people that your name actually is? And all he comes back with is, I am who I am. Meaning, my being comes from my being. My amness comes from my amness. My existence comes from my existence. This is how he makes himself known to Moses. Just like this burning bush over here, Moses, I want you to see that I am the mysterious and yet knowable, the self-existent and the holy God who will be with you from every single day from here on out. I have no beginning. I have no end. This is who I actually am. Fire typically consumes whatever it is that it burns, right? Like this bush is not being consumed. Like it's not being consumed. It is self-sustaining. It's completely miraculous what's taking place. It's 100% outside of the natural order of things. Why? Because the God, the one who is inhabiting it is the great I am, and this is who our God is. He doesn't need any gas for a fire because he's the one who speaks and the sun comes into being. Like he creates, but he doesn't need any materials to create. He works, but he never gets tired or worn out because he cannot be consumed. Like nothing's caused him and nothing's created him because he just is. He doesn't go away because he has no beginning and he has no end. I love this. He's mysterious, and yet he still chooses to be known. He's completely other than. And he's over all these things, yet in verse 7 we see that he still sees the misery of his people. He hears them crying out, and he's concerned about their suffering. And so he comes down out of mystery to rescue his people from the hand of the Egyptians. On top of all these different things, we're also saying that he's holy. And this is what we see in verse 5. He tells Moses, take off your sandals because the ground that you're standing on is holy ground. And so it's exactly what Moses does. He takes off his sandals because he doesn't want to defile the holy ground with his stinky feet and things like that. Verse 6, it says that he hides his face from this holy God because holy can't have anything to do with holy, and it completely overwhelms you every single time you were to see it, if you were to actually see it. We see this in Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah has this vision. He walks into the temple of God, and as you walk into the temple of God, Isaiah is profoundly aware of his smallness at that time. It's one of the points of the temple being as massive as it actually is. You walk into the temple, and everything about it is supposed to give you a sense of the grandiose nature of God. His holiness, his enormity, his sovereignty over all these things. And Isaiah walks in, and he's very aware of his smallness at that time. And then he begins to have this vision of the smoke filling the temples. And he sees all these angels flying around, and these angels have 3 sets of wings on them. One set of wings is covering their eyes. The other set of wings is covering their lower parts. The other set of wings is flying around. And it says that every single time, it says that while they're flying around, they're trembling in awe. Because it says that the Lord was seated on a throne, high and exalted in that temple. And just the train of his robe, the thinnest part of the trailing veil of his majesty, entirely filled the temple. And at the tiniest glimpse of the smallest part of his robe, the angels erupted into song, singing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." I mean, this is the whole Revelation scene, right? Like you see this whole scene in Revelation. They're sitting in the throne room of God, the elders, the saints, the angels, and they're beholding him in all of his fullness. And the only thing that makes sense to do is to bow down before him, eyes shielded from his glory, crying out day and night, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and who is to come." Church, like we have no capacity to fully understand what it is that he's holy. Like when they cry out those words, like we're sitting here in complete understanding that everything that I'm crying out right now is insufficient to describe who he actually is. Like holy is a word that means that he's perfect and he's completely pure in every possible way. Like no impurities in his character whatsoever. Completely perfect and untainted by sin. The way things were always supposed to be. Completely pure and other than. No equivalent for us to look at and be like, hey, that's what holy is. Like we have no understanding of what it actually means that our God is a holy God. Like the best that we can do is to come up with and be like, okay. It's kind of like that time when maybe you walked into that beautiful cathedral that one time you were visiting overseas and you walked in and you got a sense of all those stained glass windows and those high ceilings and the beauty of that architecture. And you came in and your breath was taken away as you got a tiny, tiny taste of the holiness of God. I don't know if you've ever had that experience before, but you walk into a cathedral and like you have no words to say sometimes. And you come in and like you're just like no one's talking. It's complete silence. And as you're looking around, you're getting a small taste of the holiness and the grandiose nature of our God. We try to describe it kind of like maybe it's a bride on her wedding day. The white gown is supposed to represent purity. And everybody's staring at this bride, and everybody's in awe, giving her the center stage on that day. And we're sitting here going like that's not even a fraction of a percent of what it's actually like, that he's perfectly pure and holy and righteous in all of his ways. Like the Pope or the Queen are supposed to be representatives of a holy God. It's not really our conviction structure or anything like that around here. I love the way Tozer talks about this, but he says this in the Knowledge of the Holy. He says, God is the absolute quintessence of moral excellence. God is the absolute quintessence of moral excellence. infinitely perfect in righteousness, purity, and rectitude. We cannot grasp the true meaning of the divine holiness by simply thinking of someone or something very pure and then raising the concept to the highest degree that we're capable of. God's holiness is not simply the best we know, infinitely bettered. We know nothing like the divine holiness. It stands apart, unique, unapproachable, incomprehensible, and unattainable. The natural man is blind to it. He may fear God's power and admire his wisdom, but his holiness he can't even begin to imagine. Only the Spirit of the Holy God can impart to the human spirit the knowledge of the holy. And yet that is exactly what we see him do from beginning to end. He's a mysterious, holy, self-existent God who comes and he makes himself known. And he says, you want to know who I am? I am who I am. This is who I am. I am who I am. My being begins with my being. My amness begins with my amness, and it continues to continue my amness. This is who I actually am. You want to know who I am? I am who I am. I am the knowable and mysterious, self-existent and holy God who has no beginning and has no end. And so, church, the question we've got to be asking this morning is this, like, do I know him as he really is? Do I see him as the great I am? Do I know him today when I wake up in the morning, when I think about who God is, this God that I've come here to worship? Do I see him as he is, as the great I am? Do I know his mystery as well as his knowability? Do I know the perfection of his character, his righteousness, and his holiness? I mean, the beauty of this scene, church, is that it's not just with Moses one time in a burning bush. Like, he's been making himself known from the very beginning. Paul says in Romans chapter 1, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature have clearly been seen, having been understood from what's been made, so that people are without excuse. In other words, like from the beginning, he has been the God who's been making himself known to the point that we are without excuse to know who he actually is. In other words, it's not just a burning bush, but this is what he's been doing from the very beginning of time. Thomas Edison, he says his burning bush moment, his aha moment with God where everything began to come together and finally connect for him, it came when he was studying science and the intricate workings of the universe. Now, did you know that? Like, do you know that God can be known in the middle of science? That he makes himself known in the middle of these things? I mean, this is what he says. He says, my burning bush moment came from studying the way that God made things to be. The intricate workings of the universe is when it all came together for me. Carl Sagan talks about this in The Pale Blue Dot. Carl Sagan's not a believer by any stretch of the imagination, but he talks about the pale blue dot, and there's this famous picture out there, and he points it out right there, and he simply says this. He says, that's home. He says, that's us. On that dot, everyone you've ever heard of, everyone who's ever lived, has lived out their entirety of their lives. And we sit there and we marvel at this. Like, scientists estimate the universe is 91 billion light years across. Somebody said enormity when they think of who God is. Enormous is insufficient in describing who he really is. 91 billion light years across. Like, we don't really have much of a concept for understanding what that really means. Best way I could put it like this is like if you traveled on the Millennium Falcon at the speed of light, 186,282.2 miles every single second. Not miles per hour, like Caleb gets mad at me if I'm doing 37 miles per hour and a 35. Like 186,282 miles every single second. It would take you over 1 billion lifetimes just to get from one edge of the universe to the other. In other words, like, we're talking bigger than Texas. This is what God created. And so Edison looks at that, and this is what makes him conclude. When you see everything that happens in the world, this is what he says, in the world of science, as well as the intricate inner workings of the universe, you cannot deny that there must be a captain on that bridge. And the reality, like, it's not just a burning bush moment. It's not just one time with Moses. This is how God's been revealing himself from the very beginning of time. I met other people like C.S. Lewis. He says, for him, it was the unexplainable inner longing for eternity that exists inside of every single human being. And granted, that's like C.S. Lewis and probably the only person on the planet who, like, that was the thing that really convinced him, that burning bush aha God moment. It's this inner longing inside of me for eternity. But like, this is him, and he writes about it, and he sees this thing inside of me that says, hey, if I've got this inner longing inside of me that longs for eternity, and it cannot be satisfied by anything in the present, then there must be a reason for that. It must mean that I was created for something more. Like, for other people, it's going to be the reality of the resurrection. I love the Anne Rice story. She's the famous agnostic author of all the vampire books. She talks about how in her own discovery of who God was and his revelation of him to her. She says how she was never able to shake the question, how did a group of Jewish peasants launch the greatest religious movement of the history of the world? This is the thing, as an agnostic author, she's sitting there going like, I don't understand how a group of Jewish peasants, we're talking like Peter, James, John, fishermen, unintelligent, like not impressive people by any stretch of the imagination, like how did they go and launch the greatest religious movement that the world's ever seen? And I love her conclusion. She dug in, she investigated it all, and she said this. She said, Christianity achieved what it did because Jesus rose from the dead. It was the fact of the resurrection that sent the apostles out into the world with the force necessary to create Christianity. Nothing else would have done it by that. Not exactly perfect theology or anything like that, but that's it. For others like Blaise Pascal, I love him, 17th century mathematician, brilliant scientist. It was this profound experience with God one evening. It was very much like a burning bush moment where this moment when everything just came together in his soul, and he describes it like this. He says he writes it down and he sews it in the inner lining of his coat. But here's what it said. Monday, November 23rd, 1654, from 10:30 to 12:30 in the morning, fire. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not the God of the philosophers and the sophisticated. Joy. Tears of joy. I submit myself absolutely to the Lord Jesus Christ, my rock and my redeemer. Church, have you seen him as he really is? He's been making himself known from the very beginning. Have you seen him and have you beheld his glory as he's made himself known? Like, do you dwell on his holiness? Do you think about his character? Do you go to those deep places and say, God, reveal yourself to me just a little bit more? Like, do you think about his holiness? Or have we shaped him into a God where holiness isn't even a part of his character anymore? Moses comes in, he says, who am I supposed to tell people that you are? And he says, I am who I am. In other words, like, Moses, you don't have to make anything up. You don't get to define me or shape me into your character according to your values or what's popular in 21st century America today. You don't get to define who I actually am. You don't get to shape me by your values. You don't get to treat me like Siri or Alexa, whose sole purpose is to serve you and answer any questions that you may have, simply because authority is not cool in postmodern America anymore today. You don't get to treat me only like a friend and not as an authority, because that's not in vogue today. You don't get to change me or pick and choose what you like about me just to fit a political agenda. You don't get to throw out the word holy just because everything is relative today and there is no truth. And guess what? It makes me feel a little bit bad sometimes to think that I'm not already holy. You don't get to throw these things going, no. I am who I am. This is who I actually am. Just like this bush, I'm mysterious and yet knowable at the exact same time. Self-existent and holy. No beginning and no end. Church, we got to be able to see that everything changes for Moses after he beholds the character of God. Everything for Moses in his life, it begins to change after this encounter where he sees our God, the beauty of God, the holiness of God, the grandeur of God. Everything begins to change after this experience with this bush. At the beginning of the chapter, we see Moses and he's crippled in fear and insecurity. This is his story, crippled by fear and insecurity. Verse 11, he says, who am I, God? Who in the world am I? Insecurity. That I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt. You're calling me? Who in the world am I? Church, you ever asked that question of God before? Who am I to be used of you? You know my past. You know those college years. You know my stories. You know last night. You know what's on the inside of my head. You know my failures. You know my hypocrisies. Who am I to be used of you? Who am I to lead my family when I never saw it done well growing up? Who am I to be this man of God you've called me to be when I've never seen an example in my life? Who am I to run wholeheartedly after you when everybody else around me has been telling me to settle down? Who in the world am I to be used by you and to do the things that you've called me to do? John Maxwell says that the insecurity is the number one reason people never accomplish their goals. It's this conviction. I love how he describes it. He says it's this conviction that deep down inside says, some were created to do great things, but who are you to be included in that some? This is exactly where Moses is at the beginning of this chapter. He's just killed a guy and he's on the run. Can you imagine the amount of shame that you must feel if you were in a similar boat, no matter how justified you may feel in that moment? You're going to be looking back and that me kind of going, okay, God, was that really justice that I was after, or was it vengeance? Like the second guessing, can you imagine like the things going on in your head when you're laying on the pillow at night? The dark night of the soul. After a thing like that, when you're sitting there kind of going, okay, am I disqualified from ministry now? Am I ever going to have a future again? Am I ever going to be useful? Is my life, is it already done? Have I nailed the coffin, put it in the grave? I mean, the dude was a sellout to his own people, an Israelite living in Pharaoh's home as an Egyptian while his people are being abused all around him. God, does that not disqualify me? On top of that, we read in chapter 4, like God calls him to be the leader of his people, to lead his people out of the bondage of slavery. And the man can't even talk well. He's got a stuttering problem, and he says that in chapter 4. He says, "Pardon me, my Lord. Pardon your servant," in verse 10. "I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you've spoken to your servant. I'm slow of speech and tongue." And in other words, like, who in the world am I to lead anybody when I can't even speak right? Like, how is anybody going to have confidence in me? I mean, it's a pretty legit question, right? God, how am I going to pastor or shepherd a church when so many of you are my spiritual heroes? Like, what's your thing? Who am I to be a small group leader or a leader of kids or in the youth ministry or something like that when I've got my own questions and I'm still trying to figure this thing out? And I'm still struggling and making the exact same resolutions that I did the year before, which are the same ones as the year before, which are the same ones as the year before, because guess what the reality is? I still struggle. Like, who in the world am I? And I love the way that God responds to him. He simply says this in 4:11. He says, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, for I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say." In other words, it's pretty much the same thing as he says here in chapter 3. Moses is like, "Lord, who am I to do anything?" And he's going, "I'm not even going to answer your question. Moses, I'm going to be with you every step of the way." But God, who am I to do? No. Moses, I'm going to be with you every step of the way. But God, you don't understand, like, what about my past? You remember my past, and like, I killed the dude, and no. I am who I am, and I'm going to be with you every single step of the way. But God, my heritage, I don't even know really who I am anymore, but no. I am who I am, and I'm going to be with you every single step of the way. In other words, Moses, it seems like you're focused on the wrong things. It seems like you're preoccupied with who you are, and I'm trying to show you who I am. It seems like you think that I've called you because you're qualified, and what I'm trying to show you is that I am the God who qualifies the called. Like, I'm the God who can use a bush to make my glory known. This is who I am. Like, I'm the God who could turn a stutterer into a leader of millions. I'm the God who could take an adulterer in David and turn him into a man after God's own heart. I'm the God who could take a scandal-ridden Mary Magdalene and use her to be the first herald of the resurrection. I'm the God who can speak to Lazarus and see him raised from the dead. I'm the God who can take 5 loaves of bread and a few fish and feed thousands. I'm the God who can still have a plan for Saul after he slandered my name, persecuted hundreds, and changed him into being one of the most effective missionaries this world's ever known. Jesus is going to come on the scene, and he's going to make 7 different I am statements that are all bringing us back to the scene here in Exodus chapter 3. But he says, to those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, he says, I am the bread of life. To those who are wandering in darkness, he says, I am the light of the world. To those who are in need of a fresh start, he says, I am the gate that leads to the greener pastures. To those who are crushed by guilt, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. To those who are afraid, he's saying, I am the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. To those who are lost and confused and living in the bondage of sin, he says, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. To those who are dying to bear fruit again in your life, he says, I am the vine and you are the branches. If anyone remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit, for apart from me, you can do absolutely nothing. Point of the matter, church, is this, that he doesn't call us because we've been qualified or we are already qualified. He qualifies us because we've been called. This is why Paul takes such confidence in who he is after all of his own personal failures and weaknesses. And he says, not many of you were wise by human standards, and not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. And so some of us need to hear that today, and we need to simply absorb the words of God this morning. Because we're beginning a brand new year right now, and we're sitting there kind of going, okay, Lord, who in the world am I to do any of the things that I feel like you've called me to do? And you've got the resolutions, and really they may be convictions that he's putting up on your heart. They could be callings on where he wants you to go. They could be next steps of faith that he's calling you to take. And the reality is that you sit here in a brand new year, and we come here and we sit there and say, God, but who am I to do anything that you've called me to do? Who am I to take those steps of faith? Who am I to do any of those things? And we need to hear his voice, and we need to listen to him when he says, you're focused on the wrong thing this year. I know you're not whatever it is you think you need to be enough. I know you're not enough, but the reality is I am. And I will be with you every single step of the way. Never forget, a few years back, we invited Neil Jeffrey to come in and speak at our men's barbecue that year. I don't know if any of you guys were around at that time, but if you're not familiar with Neil Jeffrey, he was a local pastor in town. Way back in the day, he was a very successful quarterback for Baylor. Sic 'em Bears, we'll give it to you on that day. Very successful quarterback there. But when we invited him to come to speak at this men's barbecue, we had no idea that we were inviting sort of a modern-day Moses in some degree to come in to speak to us that day. What you didn't know about Neil, which I didn't know at that time, was that his entire life he dealt with a massive, massive stuttering problem. His entire life. It was debilitating. It was crippling. And he gets up there and he tells a story, which you wouldn't know at that point in time as he preaches in front of a large room, but he gets up there and he tells these stories of having to go in front of all of his classmates and being frozen in fear and not being able to say anything and stuttering and the classmates making fun of him and all the bullying and everything that comes as a result of all of those different things. He talks about growing up insecure, being in fear constantly, discovering he had a good arm. But he's a quarterback that's getting in a huddle and he can't call plays because the fear of the moment takes over and he's not able to say and to tell his team what plays he's supposed to run. And so he talked about how later on he figured out he could sing, and when he was singing, he was able to speak. And so as a quarterback, even at Baylor, he would go and he would sing the plays. Can you imagine that? Isn't that awesome? He's like, Blue 42, split rides. I don't know, that was terrible. My bad. I apologize to everybody for that. But that's what he would do. He would go and he would sing the plays because he realized, hey, I'm actually able to communicate. I'm able to say things at this time. And so he goes and he shares this story of how God came and he made himself known, set him free, did this incredible work. And we're sitting there as a men's group. We're doing a Q&A at the end, and somebody asked him, they said, Neil, man, like, how did you get over this fear to the point, like, you're a preacher. And, like, the number one thing, like, you weren't able to communicate 2 words. Like, how in the world do you do that? And I loved his response. He just said, how did you get over the fear was the big question. I loved his response. He just sat there and he goes, you know, the truth be told, I've never gotten over the fear. He's like, I'm afraid every single day. I'm socially insecure. I get terrified and nervous and fearful every time I stand up. But then he just sat there and he goes, what else am I supposed to do once I've seen the living God? Like, what else do you do when you know the goodness of God? And he's made himself known to you and to me. And he goes, the reality is he's given me a story. And he's given me the greatest news in the world. What else can I do but go and trust that he's going to be with me every step of the way? And so, church, this just seems to be his pattern. Lord, who am I to be used by you? God, I've blown it. Like, you know my track record. You know my dysfunction. You know my weakness. God, who am I to be? I'm too young. People don't even know my name at work. I'm too old. Like my time is past. Who am I to be used by you? And then God just comes in and he just makes himself known, and we behold his glory, all of his beauty, the fullness of his character. He's self-existent. He's holy. He has no beginning. He has no end. He captures our affections and he does a brand new thing. And he just goes and he does the improbable over and over and over again. Church, the practice for us this week is not that we're going to go and do all these different kinds of things. It's simply a meditation. That you and I would leave this place, that we would go home, that Monday morning when we wake up, that tonight when you go to bed, that whenever your rhythm may be, that you would wake up and that you would meditate on two words, I am. That we would know him as the great I am, that we would see him as the great I am, that we would worship him as the great I am, the God who is mysterious in all of his ways, yet knowable, self-existent and holy, transcendent, omniscient, omnipotent, all-powerful, all-glorious, sovereign in all of his ways, beautiful beyond description, all of these different kinds of things. He's the God who comes and says, I am. I know you aren't, but I am. That we would take a moment this week to come and to pay attention to these things that are making us wonder, okay, God, who am I? These insecurities that weigh us down, that are deep in your heart, you probably haven't shared them with anybody, that we would take record of that we would write it out, pay attention to it, and we would put it out on a table before him, and we would listen to him when he says, I think you're focused on the wrong thing. You seem to think that it's all about who you are, but it's not about who you are, it's about who I am. That we would hear him when he says, I am who I am, the mysterious yet knowable, self-existent and holy God. I will be with you always until the end of the age. I want to wrap up where we began with what Tozer has to say about this. I think he nailed this whole subject matter probably better than anybody I've ever heard. It's a quote I've come back to a number of different times. I think about this quote kind of like a great steak dinner. Just because you've had it once doesn't mean you're done with it. Tozer puts it perfectly, and he says this. I think it would be a wonderful thing if every preacher in America would begin to preach about God and nothing else for one solid year. One solid year to preach about who God is, who he is, his attributes, his perfections, his being, the kind of God that he is, why we dare to trust him, why we can trust him, why we should trust him, why we can love him, why we should love him, why we dare not fall short. And keep on preaching about God, the triune God, and keep on until God fills the entire horizon and the whole world. Faith would spring up like the grass by the watercourses. Then let a man get up and preach a promise, and the whole congregation would say, I could trust that promise because I know the one who made it. It's my hope and my prayer for us today that you would be able to trust his promises because you know the God who made it. That you would know the great I am. And that our fixation would be away from God, here's who I am. No. Here's who I am. That we would rest in that today. That we would take those next steps of faith in whatever it may be. As the beauty of who he is just makes all of those fears and all of those insecurities seem to dissipate in its wake. Father, we do love you. God, we praise you. We offer ourselves gladly to you today, the great I am. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and who is to come. God, our words are insufficient in describing you. God, our time is not long enough to fill the pages of who you really are. All of your beauty, all of your grandeur. God, would you come in and in ways that only you can do, would you come and make yourself known to every man, woman, and child in this place? God, like a burning bush, if we've never had that before, I pray that you would make yourself known. God, would you blow our minds? Would you broaden our affections for you, Lord Jesus? God, may we be captivated by you for the rest of our days. And may we be faithful as a response to you, God. Knowing that we may not be, but you are. And may we take confidence in that today. All for your praise and all for your glory. Church, I want to give you a minute to just sit here in the quietness of your heart. The band is going to play over us, and they're going to sing over us for a minute. And in about a minute, we'll have a chance to stand and we'll sing together. But right now, would you just sit there and would you just dwell upon the reality that he is the great I am?